especially for the families and friends of the 7 young adventurers whose lives he so cruelly stole in the Belanglo State Forest south of Sydney.
The way he killed them was shocking. Some people were tortured, some people were sexually assaulted.
7 backpackers entered the woods and never returned. What was supposed to be a simple adventure turned into one of the darkest chapters in Australia's criminal history. Hidden deep inside the Belanglo State Forest, a killer was hunting strangers, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man responsible would later be known worldwide as Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer. But before his arrest, years would go by filled with fear, unanswered questions, and grieving families scattered across the globe. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the late 1980s and early 1990s. At that time, Australia had become a dream destination for young travelers. Thousands of tourists, students, and wanderers came each year with nothing more than a backpack and a plan to explore the endless highways, beaches, and forests of the country. For many of them, hitchhiking was the easiest way to get around. It was cheap, spontaneous, and seemed safe. Locals were known to be friendly, and it was common to see travelers standing by the roadside with their thumbs out, waiting for a ride. Among these travelers were 7 people who would never make it home: Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, 2 young women from the United Kingdom, Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, a German couple traveling together, Simone Schmidl, another young backpacker from Germany, and Deborah Everest and James Gibson, 2 Australian friends from Melbourne. Each of them disappeared under mysterious circumstances while hitchhiking or exploring around New South Wales between 1989 and 1992. At first, their cases were treated separately. Police suspected runaways, accidents, or even voluntary disappearances. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The first breakthrough came in September 1992, when 2 runners stumbled upon human remains in the Belanglo State Forest, about 90 minutes south of Sydney. The bodies were identified as Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, who had vanished earlier that year. Joanne had been stabbed multiple times, while Caroline was shot in the head. The violence shocked investigators and suggested a deliberate killer. The forest that once seemed peaceful was now a dumping ground for murder. For more than a year, the case stalled with no new leads or suspects. Detectives worked tirelessly, following every possible clue, but the killer seemed to have vanished without a trace. Then, in October 1993, another grim discovery was made that would change everything. Searchers combing through the dense forest found the skeletal remains of Australians James Gibson and Deborah Everest, who had disappeared in 1989 while traveling to a music festival. James's backpack and camera had been found years earlier, far from Belanglo, misleading investigators about where they might have died. Now, the truth was becoming clear. They too were victims of the same killer. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team, who realized they were dealing with a serial murderer. Forensic experts examined the remains and found evidence of extreme violence. Both victims had been brutally killed and their bodies disposed of in the same methodical way as Clark and Walters. On November 1st, 1993, police searching deeper into the forest made another horrific discovery. They found the body of Simone Schmidl, the young German backpacker who had vanished in January 1991 while hitchhiking near Liverpool. Her remains bore stab wounds similar to those of Joanne Walters, confirming the killer's signature method. Simone had been traveling alone when she disappeared after telling friends she planned to hitchhike south. Her family in Germany had desperately searched for answers, never knowing their daughter lay buried in an Australian forest. Weeks later, in late November, the investigation uncovered the final 2 victims: German couple Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, who had been missing since 1991. Anja had been decapitated, while Gabor was shot multiple times. The brutality confirmed beyond doubt that the killer was sadistic, organized, and experienced. By the end of 1993, 7 bodies had been unearthed in Belanglo State Forest, and the press gave the crimes a name that would haunt Australia: the Backpacker Murders. The investigation became one of the largest in the nation's history, involving hundreds of officers and forensic experts. Detectives analyzed every detail: the choice of victims, who were all young travelers, the isolated location deep in State Forest, the methods of restraint and torture. They believed the killer knew the forest intimately and likely lived nearby. The perpetrator had to be someone who could navigate the dense woodland without getting lost, and knew exactly where to dispose of bodies without detection. While the massive search continued, a crucial witness emerged who would crack the case wide open. In 1990, a British backpacker named Paul Onions had been hitchhiking south of Sydney when a man who called himself Bill offered him a ride. During the trip, the friendly driver suddenly changed, becoming aggressive and threatening. He pulled a gun and tried to tie Paul up with rope. Paul managed to escape by jumping from the moving vehicle and running along the highway, where he flagged down a passing motorist. He reported the terrifying attack to police, but with no physical evidence and only a description, the lead went nowhere. Now, with the murders making international headlines, Paul contacted Australian authorities from England and provided a detailed description of his attacker. The description pointed directly to a local man named Ivan Milat. Born in 1944, Ivan Milat was one of 14 children raised in a strict working-class family in the outer suburbs of Sydney. He had a long criminal history dating back to his teens, including theft, burglary, assaults, and even earlier accusations of abduction that never resulted in convictions. By the 1990s, he worked as a road laborer for the Department of Main Roads, traveling highways across New South Wales for work. This job gave him intimate knowledge of remote routes, isolated forests, and back roads that most people never saw. Belanglo State Forest was within easy reach of where he lived and worked, making it the perfect hunting ground. Detectives realized that only someone with such extensive local knowledge could repeatedly use the same forest to dispose of bodies without being caught. Surveillance was quietly placed on Milat, while police methodically built their case, gathering evidence and witness statements. In May 1994, after months of investigation, officers executed search warrants and raided Milat's home in the Sydney suburb of Eagle Vale. What they found inside left absolutely no doubt about his guilt. The house contained a horrifying collection of belongings stolen from the murdered backpackers, including clothing, cameras, camping equipment, and personal items. Weapons were discovered that were consistent with those used in the killings, including guns and knives. Most damning of all was camping gear that had belonged to the German victims, proving Milat had kept trophies from his crimes. The evidence was so overwhelming that even his defense lawyers would struggle to explain it away. Ivan Milat was immediately arrested and charged with the murders of all 7 victims. The quiet suburban road worker was finally unmasked as Australia's most notorious serial killer, who had terrorized international travelers for years. The trial opened in March 1996 at the New South Wales Supreme Court in Sydney. It would last 15 intense weeks and become one of the most watched court cases in Australian history. Prosecutors methodically presented the mountain of physical evidence linking Milat directly to the victims and the crime scenes. They showed jurors the personal items found in his home that belonged to each victim. Expert forensic testimony detailed the horrific injuries inflicted on each person. Ballistics experts matched bullets to weapons found at Milat's property. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Paul Onions took the witness stand and identified Milat in court as the man who had tried to abduct him 6 years earlier. Onions had flown from England specifically to testify, and his calm, detailed account of the attack provided crucial evidence of Milat's method of operation. The defense team argued desperately that evidence could have been planted by police or that other members of the large Milat family might be involved. They suggested a conspiracy to frame their client, but the sheer volume of physical evidence directly tied to each victim made these arguments impossible to believe. There were simply too many items from too many different people found in Milat's possession. For the families of the victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal that forced them to relive their worst nightmares. Relatives flew from the United Kingdom and Germany to attend court sessions and hear painful testimony about how their loved ones died. Graphic crime scene photographs were shown to jurors. Autopsy reports detailed the torture each victim endured. Ballistics evidence described the final moments of their lives. Yet the family's presence in court sent a powerful message that these young travelers would never be forgotten and that justice must be served. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for 5 days before reaching their unanimous verdict. On July 27, 1996, Ivan Milat was found guilty of murdering all 7 backpackers. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, without any possibility of parole. The judge described the crimes as calculated, cold-blooded, and among the worst in Australian criminal history. Milat showed no emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining his innocence to the end. Even Milat would spend the next 23 years behind bars, appealing his convictions multiple times, but every appeal failed. He never confessed to the murders and never showed any remorse for his victims or their families. Instead, he spent his remaining years in maximum security prison, becoming a symbol of evil that parents used to warn their children about the dangers of hitchhiking. Belanglo State Forest became synonymous with fear and tragedy. Warning signs were erected at entrances, reminding visitors of its dark history. For years, criminologists and psychology experts studied Milat as a textbook example of an organized, sadistic serial killer who used charm and local knowledge to hunt his victims. He maintained his innocence until his death from cancer in October 2019, taking whatever secrets he still harbored to his grave. Some investigators believe he may have been responsible for other unsolved disappearances, but those cases will likely never be resolved. The legacy of the backpacker murders continues to this day. 7 young people entered those woods seeking adventure and freedom, but instead found death at the hands of a monster who preyed on their trust and vulnerability. Their lives were cut tragically short by a man who used his knowledge of the Australian wilderness to lure them into his deadly trap. But their memory endures as a reminder to travelers everywhere to be cautious about accepting reads from strangers. The case also reminded Australia that evil can hide behind the most ordinary appearance, and that monsters often look just like everyone else. The names Caroline Clark, Joanne Walters, James Gibson, Deborah Everest, Simone Schmidl, Anya Habshid, and Gabor Neugebauer are forever linked to one of the nation's darkest chapters. But they are remembered not just as victims, but as young people who died, pursuing their dreams of adventure and discovery.